What's up, YouTube? It's Chris with Murphy Firearms Training. I got a question the other day, and I thought it was a great question. So I said, you know what? It's a good one to do a video on. So obviously, in a reloading manual here, I'm going to show you the top here. It says never exceed or max charge, and you'll get these numbers here. And of course, most people would tell you take that number. So, if I just take this particular load here, 53 grains, and you're going to cut that off by at least 10% and work up to that. Well, 53 grains, 10% would be 5.3. So you cut 5.3 grains off that. That's going to put you, let's just say, round 48. Well, that says 49.8. Why that? Why would you start there? And some manuals even go so far as to this column here doesn't say to start, but it actually says minimum. And someone asked me a really good question. They're new to reloading, and they said, why would you have a minimum? And why is it so wildly 49, 42, 50? Those are all pretty close. 35, that's pretty different. 14. Why is it so wildly different? So I want to get into why there's a minimum load, and there's actually 3 reasons. Now, reason number one is if you take a fired case, like this 454 Casull here, when you fire this case, primer goes off, ignites the gunpowder pushes the bullet out of the crimp, tries to push it down the barrel. In that process, the case actually expands and seals the path. Now, this is especially important in autoloaders and high-pressure rifles. With revolvers, the gas is going to leak out at the cylinder gap, so it's not quite as big of a deal, although it can matter. But with your autoloaders, that seal against the chamber wall directs all of that pressure and all that gas down the barrel. That is number one. Different cartridges have different thickness of brass. So an example, a 4570 brass is much thinner than a 458 Win Mag. A 45 Colt brass is much thinner than a 454 Casull because they operate at lower pressures. So 45 Colt can have a lower minimum charge because it's thinner brass. It expands easier. Also much easier to size. So that's reason number one. Now, I'll tell you an anecdote here, a story. I had a 45 Colt lever gun, and I decided to load below the minimum. Why? Because I was out plinking, and I wanted something that was just like a 22, basically. And I learned the hard way that if you load a 45 Colt lever gun below the minimum, the brass does not expand and seal to the chamber walls, and it can actually blow gas back in the shooter's face. So that was my first exposure with following load data like it says, and learning the hard way, because that's number one. Number two is bullet design. So I've got a lead bullet here without a gas check. This is Will Waits. This is a hard cast gas check commercial bullet. This is a soft lead alloy with the hollow base. And then I've got an all copper bullet. And then I've got a commercially made handgun bullet that's very soft lead. And somewhere up here, I have a jacketed bullet, a jacket with a lead core. Now, I'm going to teach you a fancy word. This fancy word is obturate, okay? And all that means is that the pressure that's put on the back of this bullet makes it expand to seal the bore. Now, not as important with copper jacketed or all monometal brass or copper projectiles. However, if there's leakage past these copper jacketed or monometal projectiles, you get erratic velocities and you're going to get more fouling and things like that in your barrel. But that's it, okay? With lead projectiles, if it doesn't obturate, you get a couple of problems. Number one is you can actually get the bullet melting in the bore for some of the softer alloys. And again, you get erratic velocities and things like that. So now, start with your jacketed bullet. Some of these have very hard lead cores and very thick jackets. Some of these have very soft lead cores and very thin jackets. So again, you buy the bullet for the application. And a simple example I give is this is for 4570. This is for 458 Winchester Magnum. There's a difference in velocities and pressures, and so this bullet has to be tougher, and that means it's going to be harder to make obturate. If you fire this in a 45-70, you're going to get more erratic velocities because you're shooting the bullet for something it wasn't intended for. But I'm going to focus mostly on lead bullets. So what does that mean? Well, this soft lead bullet can be driven at lower velocities. Well, it's designed for 45 ACP. And so this will run, 800 to 1,000 feet per second and easily seal the bore and not let any gases by. Okay? This is a little harder bullet. If you run it as low as 1,000 feet per second, it may not obturate. You may actually get some issues. Okay? This is a hard cast bullet. You want it to obturate, you're going to have to run it hard. I mean, fast. This is made for the 460 Smith & Wesson Magnum. It is meant to go 14, 16, 1,700 feet per second. I'd even load that on a 452 rifle, like 450 Bushmaster. This is a black powder bullet. It's made for the old 4570 trapdoor loads. Has a hollow base. This will obturate 800, 900 feet per second. Right, so this bullet with the hollow base that's made for black powder, it's got a SPG black powder lube, is made for this like really light 1,000 feet per second 4570 load, right? Or this 971 feet per second. Very, 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 very slow load. Why? Because that hollow base is going to obturate and seal the bore. Okay, so that's the second reason, right? So the case has got to seal the chamber. The bullet has got to obturate to fill the bore. The third one is case fill, case capacity. So if you take a big fat case like this one, this 454 Casull, a 4570 Government, 45 Colt is a great example. Some powders do not like to ignite unless there's an entire cylinder of powder over the primer spark. And so let's say I took a powder, a famous one would be Tight Group. This case would only hold 7 grains of Tight Group. And it would literally go to here in the case. I mean, it would just barely any powder. Well, Tight Group is designed that when you turn this on its side and all the powder's laying long ways, that when the primer sparks and that spark goes out and hits the powder ignites. Well, some powders, if you've got less than half of the case full and you turn it sideways and this flash hole from the primer is not covered in powder, the powder ignites poorly or the powder ignites haphazardly. And so you get really awkward velocity readings, you get really weird pressure readings, you get poor ignition, you get a lot of unburned powder in your barrel, things like that. And so that is the third reason that there's a minimum charge, is that with some powders, if you don't fill more than half the case, you're going to get very, very, very poor ignition. This minimum charge, this start charge, takes that into account. So anyway, those are the 3 reasons that you have a minimum charge or a starting charge in your loading data. And really and truthfully, folks, you don't want to go under that data without knowing more about the powder and more about the bullet. And I'm not going to say it's not safe to go below that, but you might lead your bore. You might have powder come back in your face because your case doesn't seal your chamber. Things like that. Or you may get some poor or erratic ignition. So if you're going to go below that starting value, make sure you know what you're doing. Make sure you've researched your powder and your fill rates and all those things. So anyway, guys, I hope this helps. I hope it's been interesting for you. Please like and subscribe. Give us a thumbs up. And if you have questions, please leave them in the comments. Thanks so much.